The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted like forgotten promises and grit. It swirled around the auction block, a crude wooden stage set in the center of a town that God had seemingly overlooked. On that stage stood 3 women, their hands bound loosely in front of them, their heads bowed not in submission, but in the heavy exhaustion of grief. They were beautiful, even with the dirt smudging their cheeks and the fear clinging to them like a shroud. The first, Lena, had fire in her eyes, a defiant glare that met the leering crowd and promised retribution. The second, Maria, trembled visibly, her prayers silent whispers on chapped lips. The third, Clara, was still as a statue, her gaze fixed on a crack in the wooden planks, as if the entire world had been reduced to that single, splintered line. They were widows, their husbands lost in a supposed mining collapse just a month prior, and now they were being sold as indentured servants to cover a phantom debt. The auctioneer, a man with a face like worn leather and a soul to match, raised his gavel. His voice was a rasp that cut through the tense silence. "Let's start the bidding on this fine lot. Strong backs, pleasant to look at. Who'll give me $50? A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the assembly of dusty ranchers and grim-faced opportunists. This was not a sale, it was a dissection. Just then, a horse and rider appeared at the edge of the square, moving with a purpose that parted the crowd like a ship's bow through water. The rider was a woman, tall in the saddle, dressed not in a restrictive dress but in practical buckskin trousers and a tailored riding coat. Her face was framed by a wide-brimmed hat, but even in its shadow, her features were sharp, intelligent, and etched with a sorrow that had long ago hardened into resolve. This was Elara Vance, owner of the sprawling Twin Peaks ranch, a woman who had built an empire from the ashes of her own tragedy and had not been seen in town for nearly 2 years. She reined in her black stallion, the animal as silent and imposing as its master. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the stage, taking in the 3 women, the jeering crowd, and the man who stood beside the auctioneer, his grin wider and more predatory than any other. Elara's hand tightened on her reins, the leather creaking in the sudden, sharp silence that her arrival had commanded. The air grew thick, the dust settled, and every eye turned from the victims on the block to the rich lady rancher who had just entered the devil's arena. The man beside the auctioneer stepped forward, his considerable guts straining the buttons of his brocade vest. This was Judge Silas Blackwood, a man who owned the law in Redemption Gulch and most everything else besides. His face was fleshy and pink, his smile a wet slash that never reached his small, piggish eyes. He was the one who held the debt, the one who had orchestrated this entire grim spectacle. He saw the widows not as people, but as assets, decorations for his grim estate on the edge of town. He raised a plump finger, silencing a low murmur that had started in the crowd. $50, he boomed, his voice oozing a false joviality. A pittance for such resilient stock. I will open the bidding at $200. His gaze slid over the 3 women, lingering on Lena's defiant face with a possessive hunger that made the air feel cold. The auctioneer, a puppet on Blackwood's string, nodded eagerly. $200 from the Honorable Judge Blackwood. Do I hear $250? The crowd was silent. No one dared bid against the judge. It wasn't just about money, it was about survival. To cross Blackwood was to invite ruin, to find your land deed challenged, your water rights revoked, or your character slandered from the very bench he was meant to uphold. He was the town's cancer, and everyone was too afraid to cut it out. Blackwood's smile widened. It was the smile of a predator that knew its prey was already trapped. He was savoring the moment, the public display of his absolute power. He looked toward Elara Vance, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes at her silent, judgmental presence. He expected her to turn and ride away, another soul intimidated by his authority. But Elara did not move. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried across the square with the clarity of a ringing bell. 300. The words dropped into the silence like stones into a still pond. Every head whipped back towards her. The judge's smile faltered, his face darkening like a thunderhead. The 3 widows on the stage looked up for the first time, a single, shared spark of disbelief and desperate hope in their eyes. The battle had been joined. The auctioneer's jaw went slack, his eyes darting from Elara to Judge Blackwood as if watching a rattlesnake face off against a hawk. He had not expected a real contest, merely a performance for the judge's ego. $300. I have $300 from Mrs. Vance, he stammered, his professional rhythm broken. Judge Blackwood's face purpled with rage. He saw this not as a transaction, but as a direct challenge to his dominion. He shot a venomous glare at Elara, who met it with an unnerving calm. To expose the depth of his depravity, he decided to reveal the so-called truth. He gestured to the auctioneer, who cleared his throat and addressed the crowd with renewed, if forced, vigor. Let it be known, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying a new, malicious edge, these women are not merely indentured. They are sold to settle the debt of their late husbands, a debt owed directly to Judge Blackwood for the mining equipment that failed, causing the unfortunate accident. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The twist was not just that they were in debt, but that the debt was to the very man who profited from their husbands' deaths. It was a closed loop of evil, perfectly legal and utterly monstrous. The auctioneer continued, the debt stands at $1,000. Any winning bid below this amount indebts the buyer to the judge for the remainder. However, the winner also receives the deed to the widow's small, worthless plots of land. It was a masterstroke of cruelty. He wasn't just selling the women, he was selling their ruin, their past, and their future, all while ensuring he either got his money or a new victim to squeeze. He had laid his trap in the open, confident that no one would dare step into it. The judge smirked, his confidence restored. He had just revealed the true cost was not just money, but a direct entanglement with him. He believed he had checkmated the reclusive rancher. He looked at Lena, Maria, and Clara, their faces now masks of fresh horror, understanding that they were not just being sold, but permanently chained to the architect of their misery. Their last flicker of hope seemed to die, extinguished by the sheer, calculated evil of the man who held all the cards. Judge Blackwood let the weight of his revelation settle over the crowd. He raised his voice, thick with triumph and disdain. In that case, he bellowed, looking directly at Elara, I bid $1,000. I will have the women, the land, and my debt settled in full. A wave of murmurs washed over the onlookers. It was an immense sum, far more than anyone would pay. He was ending the auction, claiming his prize, and humiliating the woman who dared defy him all in one move. He folded his arms over his chest, a king surveying his conquered territory. The auctioneer turned his gaze to Elara, a sneer playing on his lips. The bid is $1,000. Going once. The silence stretched, tight as a hangman's rope. On the stage, Maria began to sob quietly, the sound a heartbreaking punctuation to the tension. Lena's defiant posture finally broke, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Clara closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. It was over. They were to be delivered into the hands of the monster who had taken everything from them. Elara Vance sat on her horse, her face unreadable in the shade of her hat. For a moment, it looked as if she might turn her stallion and ride away, leaving the town to its rotten core. What did she owe these women? She had her own ghosts, her own fortress of solitude to protect. To pay such a sum, to invite the direct wrath of a man like Blackwood, was to purchase a war, not just 3 people. What would you do in her place? Would you sacrifice your peace, your fortune, your safety, for strangers bound for hell? Would you ride away and let evil win, or would you light a match in a room full of gunpowder? Tell me what you would choose in the comments below. Because what Elara Vance did next, nobody saw coming. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel, so you never miss a story of courage that changes the world. The auctioneer's voice cut through the air again, dripping with finality. Going twice. The gavel was in the air, a wooden hammer ready to seal 3 fates. But before it could fall, Elara's voice sliced through the tension once more, as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. $2,000. The sum was so absurd, so astronomical, that for a moment, the crowd did not react. They simply stared, mouths agape, as the number echoed in the square. Then, a wave of shock washed over them. $2,000. It was more than the judge's entire estate was worth. It was a fortune. It was an act of war declared in currency. Judge Blackwood's jaw dropped. The smug, triumphant look on his face melted away, replaced by stunned, sputtering disbelief. He looked at Ilara as if she had sprouted a second head. The auctioneer froze, his arm still raised, the gavel seeming to weigh 1,000 pounds. T2, 2,000, he stammered, looking to Blackwood for guidance. But the judge was speechless, his mind reeling. Ilara Vance dismounted from her stallion in one fluid motion. She walked forward, her boots making no sound in the thick dust, and stopped directly in front of the auction block. She pulled a leather satchel from her side and from it produced a thick stack of banknotes, bound with twine. She tossed it onto the auctioneer's podium. The thud was the loudest sound in Redemption Gulch. "In cash," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "The women are mine. Draw up the bill of sale." "And the deeds to their land," the auctioneer, sweating now, fumbled with the money, his eyes wide. He looked at the judge, who was trembling with a rage so profound it seemed to choke him. He could not counter the bid. He was beaten, publicly and financially, by a woman he had dismissed. He opened his mouth, but only a strangled noise came out. Sheriff Brody, an aging lawman who had spent years looking the other way, took a half-step forward, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his pistol. His gaze met Ilara's, and in that fleeting moment, a silent understanding passed between them. A line had been drawn, and he was finally choosing a side. Ilara turned her attention to the widows, her expression softening for the first time. "Cut them loose," she commanded the auctioneer. Her gaze fell on the judge one last time, cold and clear. "You have your money, Judge. Now get out of my sight." Ilara led the three women and her stallion away from the stunned crowd, leaving Judge Blackwood stewing in a silent, murderous fury. The walk to the Twin Peaks ranch was long and silent. Lena, Maria, and Clara followed a few paces behind her, a mixture of fear, confusion, and fragile hope warring on their faces. They had been bought, saved from one monster only to be delivered into the hands of a mysterious, powerful woman. They did not know if they had been traded from one cage to another. When they arrived at the ranch, it was nothing like Blackwood's grim, ostentatious manner. The Twin Peaks was a sprawling, beautifully maintained property with a sturdy, welcoming ranch house, surrounded by fields of healthy livestock and blooming wildflowers. It was a place of life, not of dominion. Ilara led them into the house, which was clean, spacious, and filled with a quiet, lingering sadness. On the mantelpiece was a single-framed photograph of a smiling man and a young boy, their faces frozen in a moment of happiness long since past. This was the source of Ilara's isolation, the ghosts of the husband and son she had lost to bandits on this very land years ago. She had built the ranch's high walls as much to keep the world out as to protect her assets. She turned to the three women, who stood huddled together by the door. She didn't issue orders. She didn't treat them like property. Instead, she looked them each in the eye. "My name is Ilara Vance," she said simply. "You are not my servants. You are not my prisoners. Judge Blackwood is a disease, and I will not let him spread. This is a safe place. You can stay here as long as you need. There are rooms upstairs. There is food in the kitchen. When you are ready, you can leave and start a new life. The deeds to your lands are yours. I will sign them over. The choice," she finished, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely showed, "is yours." Maria started to weep, but this time with relief. Clara simply nodded, her observant eyes taking in Ilara's sincerity. Lena, the defiant one, stepped forward. Her voice was hoarse. "Why? Why would you do this for us?" Ilara's gaze drifted to the photograph on the mantel. "Because no one was there to do it for me," she whispered. Judge Blackwood did not accept defeat. Humiliation had curdled into a venomous obsession. He could not touch Ilara's fortune or her fortress of a ranch with brute force, so he retreated to the weapon he knew best, the corrupted law. He spent 2 days locked in his study, poring over legal texts, his mind twisting words and statutes into instruments of revenge. On the 3rd day, he emerged with a cruel smile and a freshly penned legal document. He claimed that the auction had been fraudulent. He fabricated a clause in the original debt agreement, a clause stating that the indentured had to be held within the town limits for a period of 1 month for public claim. By taking them to her ranch beyond the town's edge, he argued, Elara Vance had violated the terms of the sale, rendering it null and void. He issued a warrant, stamped with his own judicial seal, for the immediate seizure and return of his property. He handed the warrant to his two most brutish deputies, men who owed their jobs to his patronage and their loyalty to fear. "Go to the Twin Peaks," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Bring the women back. Use whatever force is necessary. Mrs. Vance is obstructing justice." The deputies rode out, emboldened by the legal document they carried, believing it made their thuggery righteous. They arrived at the gates of the Twin Peaks ranch in a cloud of dust and arrogance. One of them dismounted and pounded on the heavy wooden gate. "Elara Vance," he shouted. "By order of Judge Silas Blackwood, we have a warrant to reclaim the 3 widows. Open this gate." Inside the house, the women, who had just begun to breathe freely for the first time in weeks, froze in terror. The sound of the law was the sound of their nightmares returning. Maria hid her face in her hands. But Elara did not flinch. She strode to the main door, a Winchester rifle held loosely in her hand. She had known the judge would not remain silent. She had been waiting for his next move. The fight was not over, it had just followed her home. The deputies' shouting echoed across the ranch yard, a harsh violation of the newfound peace. Maria was pale with terror, but Lena's fear was quickly being replaced by a hot, simmering anger. This was her life, their lives, being treated like a game of legal chess by a corrupt tyrant. It was Clara, the quiet one, who spoke first. Her voice was steady, infused with a sudden, startling strength. "He will not take us back," she said, looking at Elara. She reached into the small carpet bag that held her only remaining possessions and pulled out a worn leather-bound book. It was her late husband's prospecting ledger. "My Thomas," she said, her fingers tracing the faded lettering on the cover, "he was a meticulous man. He wrote everything down. He didn't trust the judge." She opened the ledger. The pages were filled with neat columns of figures, dates, and notes. "Blackwood didn't just sell them faulty equipment," Clara explained, her voice gaining confidence. "He sold them claims on salted mines, land he knew was barren. He charged them for supplies they never received. It's all here. The dates, the costs, the lies. The final entry, it's a note my husband wrote the night before he went to the mine. He said he and the others were going to confront the judge the next day. They never got the chance. It was the proof they needed. The mine collapse was no accident, it was murder, executed to silence men who were about to expose a massive fraud." Just as this revelation hung in the air, the sound of an approaching horse came from the back of the ranch, not the front gate. Sheriff Brody appeared, his face grim but resolute. He had ridden the long way around, avoiding the main road. "Heard the judge sent his dogs," Brody said, nodding towards the gate. "Figured you could use another gun. What you did in town, it woke something up." "Not just in me." Elara looked from the damning ledger in Clara's hands to the determined face of the sheriff. An alliance was forming, forged in the fires of injustice. She was no longer a lone woman defending her fortress. She was the leader of a resistance. The fear in the room had been replaced by something far more powerful, the cold, hard resolve of those with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Elara handed the Winchester to Lena, whose hands closed around the wooden stock with a natural certainty. "Guard the back," she instructed. She looked at the sheriff. Brody, with Mia, they walked to the front gate, Clara following close behind, clutching the ledger like a holy book. Elara slid open the small viewing grate in the gate. The 2 deputies sneered when they saw her. "Open up, Vance," one of them demanded, waving the warrant. "Or we'll break it down." Elara's voice was calm, but carried the lethal chill of an alpine wind. "That warrant," she said, "is a piece of paper signed by a murderer and a thief. It's worthless here." The deputies laughed. "Brave words." "The judge owns this territory and not anymore," Elara replied. Just then, a noise from the main road made the deputies turn. A small crowd of townspeople, armed with farm tools and old hunting rifles, was marching towards the ranch. At their head was the blacksmith, a man whose brother had been ruined by Blackwood years ago. Sheriff Brody's public defiance had been the spark. Ilara's stand had fanned it into a flame. The town was finally rising up. Seeing his authority evaporating, the lead deputy made a fatal mistake. He drew his pistol. "This is your last chance," he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. But before he could aim, Sheriff Brody's gun was already out. "Drop it," the sheriff commanded, his voice the boom of righteous authority he hadn't used in years. Simultaneously, from a high window in the ranch house, the crack of a rifle echoed. A shot from Lena splintered the wooden gatepost right next to the deputy's head. He dropped his gun as if it were on fire. Before the chaos could escalate further, a new rider appeared, Judge Blackwood himself, his face a mask of apoplectic rage at seeing the town turned against him. "Traitors! All of you," he screamed. "I am the law." Clara stepped forward, holding up the ledger. "No," she said, her voice ringing out across the yard. "You are a killer. And this is your confession." Blackwood's eyes fixed on the book, and for the first time, raw, primal fear broke through his arrogance. He was exposed. He spurred his horse, trying to flee, but the crowd swarmed him, pulling him from the saddle. The reign of Judge Silas Blackwood was over, ending not with a bang, but with the turning of a page in a dead man's book. 1 year later, the dust in Redemption Gulch tasted different. It tasted of hope. The Twin Peaks Ranch was no longer a fortress of solitude but a thriving community. Judge Blackwood had been tried and sent to a federal prison, his corruption exposed by the contents of the ledger and the testimony of a dozen townspeople he had wronged. Sheriff Brody, his integrity restored, now upheld a law that was fair and just. The ranch itself had transformed. Ilara Vance was no longer a recluse. The sadness in her eyes had been replaced by the warm light of purpose. She had found something she thought was lost forever, a family. Lena, with her fierce spirit and sharp mind, had taken over the ranch's finances, proving to be an even shrewder businesswoman than Ilara. She had found her power not in defiance, but in building something that would last. Maria, whose gentle hands had once been wrung in fear, had discovered a gift for healing. She tended to the livestock and cultivated a vast garden of medicinal herbs, becoming the unofficial doctor for the entire valley. Her touch, once trembling, was now a source of comfort and life. Clara, the quiet observer, had become the community's heart. She started a small school in the ranch house for the local children, teaching them to read and write, ensuring the next generation would be armed with knowledge, the one weapon no tyrant could ever take away. They were not widows. They were not property. They were founders. They had taken their grief and injustice and built a paradise from it. Ilara often stood on her porch in the evening, watching the 3 women she had bought at auction now moving with the grace and confidence of queens in their own kingdom. She had spent $2,000 not to buy people, but to buy a future, for them and for herself. The moral of this story is etched into the very soil of that valley: courage is a seed. One person's willingness to stand against the dark can give light to 100 others. It proves that true wealth is not what you own, but what you are willing to fight for, and that a family is not just born of blood, but forged in the fires of loyalty and love. Now, don't let this be the last story you see. We have an even more powerful tale waiting for you. Click on the video on your screen right now, and remember to subscribe so that you are always the first to see when a new story of true justice is told.